All right, so are you ready for this? We're diving into some pretty interesting stuff today, all about seduction. Yeah, you heard that right. Seduction. We'll be looking at a course called Maximum Seduction, but don't worry, we're not going to be giving you like cheesy pickup lines or anything. We're going way deeper into like the psychology behind it all. Like, how do you use language to figure out what someone really wants? And how can you, well, maybe apply those techniques to everyday situations?
It's amazing to me how this course really breaks down those mechanics of influence. Like they say, seduction really comes down to one thing, persuasion,
Mm.
and specifically like sexual persuasion.
Yeah, and they don't hold back on the language. It can be a little much sometimes. But at its core, it's this idea of persuasion, right? They believe that a woman. So if you can figure out what those needs are, well, you can show her how to fulfill them.
They actually describe women as walking masses of needs and wants, which
Yeah.
is, well,
Billy.
it's something, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I think instead of like judging that perspective,
Mhm.
let's just use it to like understand their approach, right?
Yeah.
They're basically saying that relationships work in this kind of like transactional way,
Yeah.
where a man's job is to figure out this roadmap of a woman's desires.
Okay, so that's where the solicitation thing comes in, right?
Yeah.
They actually have a specific way they suggest asking questions. It's something like, what's important to you about, and then you fill in the blank, like, what's important to you about a relationship, or a boyfriend, or a lover, or even like a sexual experience. It seems like they're trying to get women to just lay it all out on the table, their values and what they're looking for.
Exactly, yeah. And they break this whole elicitation process down to 3 levels. You start with like a general value, like trust. Pretty
Yeah.
basic, right? Then you go deeper by asking like, what's important to you about trust? And that might lead to something like honesty, right? And then finally, you try to figure out the end value, the core motivation. So in this case, it might be something like feeling secure.
It's funny, that three-level approach actually reminds me of like good active listening. You're not just like hearing the words someone's saying, but you're really trying to get at the why behind them. I think I've even done something similar without realizing it. Like when I'm trying to help a friend with a problem, I often ask those kinds of follow-up questions, just to get to the heart of the matter.
You're right. And I think it shows how techniques used in one context, like in this case, seduction, can also be applied to everyday communication. I mean, active listening is really just about making someone feel understood.
Yeah.
And that's important in any kind of relationship, whether it's romantic or not.
Okay, so let's say you've done all this elicitation and you've got all this information about a woman's values. What does maximum seduction say you should actually do with it?
Well, they really emphasize this idea of mirroring. You're essentially reflecting those desires back to her to create this, like, deep connection. It's not just about flattery. It's about weaving those elicited values into the conversation to show how compatible you are and, like, reinforce the attraction.
That makes a lot of sense to me, actually. Like, I think that we're all drawn to people who share our values, right? So if you can show that alignment early on, it just naturally creates a connection. It's like speaking the same language, even if that language is about something as complex as emotional needs.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Course argues that this validation is like incredibly powerful. It goes way beyond superficial attraction and creates this feeling of, like being seen and understood.
But how do you know if that connection is genuine? I mean, are you really connecting with her or just with this like image of her desires that you've created?
That's a good question. And it brings up some of the ethical considerations that we have to think about. Are we just meeting someone's needs in a way that benefits both people, or are we crossing a line into manipulation?
It's like that debate about advertising. Is it informing consumers or creating artificial needs? But in the context of dating, it feels even more complicated because you're dealing with emotions and vulnerability.
Exactly, yeah. The stakes are definitely higher when we're talking about personal relationships, and there's always that potential for exploitation.
So how does maximum seduction deal with those ethical questions?
Well, they do mention consent and respecting boundaries, but it feels more like an afterthought than a core principle. And some of the language they use, like slipping inside her mind, makes me a little uneasy.
Yeah, that's kind of creepy, honestly. It doesn't really sound like genuine connection or mutual respect.
Right, exactly. And that's why it's so important to approach these techniques with caution and a lot of self-awareness. We need to be really honest with ourselves about our intentions and make sure we're not using these tools to pressure or coerce someone.
This is really making me think about how powerful language can be and how important it is to use it responsibly.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, right? And the more we understand about how language can influence us, the better we can protect ourselves from being manipulated.
Okay, well, maximum seduction doesn't shy away from strong language. They talk about specific language patterns that are designed to, like, subtly influence a woman's perception. And some of them sound, well, kind of sneaky.
They're really into what they call adverb-adjective presuppositions. These are words like naturally, easily, or comfortably. They basically frame statements as inherently true without even saying it directly.
Can you give me an example? Like, how would that sound in a real conversation?
Imagine someone saying, "You'll naturally find yourself feeling more comfortable around me as we get to know each other."
Hmm.
That naturally there is doing a lot of work, right? It's subtly implying that feeling comfortable is an inevitable outcome.
Oh, wow. It's like you're planting a seed in their mind without them even realizing it. That's both clever and kind of unsettling. So what other language patterns do they use?
Well, they also talk a lot about presuppositions of awareness. These are words like realize, aware, or experience. They're meant to direct your attention and force you to think about something internally. So instead of saying you should feel good about this, they might say, are you aware of how good this feels?
It's amazing how just changing the wording a little bit can completely shift the whole dynamic of a conversation. They're not telling you what to think, but they're definitely trying to steer your thoughts in a certain direction.
Exactly, yeah. It's all about using language to subtly influence perception and kind of create the reality you want.
Okay, this is starting to feel like a masterclass in covert communication tactics. What other techniques do they talk about?
Well, they spend a lot of time on something called embedded commands. These are even more direct. They're short phrases delivered with a specific tone of voice and a pause. And they're designed to basically bypass your conscious resistance and directly influence your behavior.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Can you give me an example of what an embedded command sounds like?
So instead of saying, imagine how amazing this could be, you might say, as you consider all the possibilities, feel the excitement building. The emphasis and the pause on feel the excitement building are what turns it into a command.
Whoa. That's kind of scary, to be honest. It sounds like something out of a hypnosis session. You're not directly telling someone what to do, but you're definitely trying to mess with their subconscious.
Yeah, and that's why we need to be so careful with these techniques, even if they work. We have to ask ourselves if we're using them responsibly. Are we respecting the other person's autonomy?
This is a good reminder that knowledge is power. And the more we understand about how language can be used to influence us, the better communicators we can be both as speakers and as listeners.
Exactly, yeah. It's
Yeah.
about using this knowledge consciously
Mhm.
and ethically.
Well, this deep dive into maximum seduction has been eye-opening. It's made me think about the power of language in a whole new way.
You too.
And it's not just about dating or seduction, right? These techniques are everywhere.
You see them in advertising, in marketing, in politics, even just in everyday conversations.
All right, well, I feel like we've just scratched the surface of this maximum seduction material. There's still so much to unpack.
Yeah, definitely.
In the next part, we'll go deeper into how these techniques can be applied in real life and whether they can ever be used ethically and responsibly. So stay tuned. All right, so we're back and ready to keep digging into this maximum seduction stuff. We've talked about persuasion, needs, and even those, well, kind of strange language patterns. But now I'm wondering, how do they actually suggest you use all this in real life?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? Like, knowing the theory is one thing, but turning it into, actual charm and connection, that's a whole other story.
Exactly. I'm picturing like a bad dating montage with cheesy pickup lines and awkward silences. How do you go from like adverb adjective presuppositions to actually making a real connection with someone?
Well, the course really emphasizes this idea of uh, weaving the information you've elicited into the conversation, but doing it organically. It's almost like you're like a tailor making a custom suit. You're using the woman's own values as the fabric of your interaction.
So no more generic compliments or bragging about your achievements.
Nope, not at all. Instead, you're showing her that you really understand her worldview. So, for example, let's say you figured out that her end value is feeling secure. You might say something like, it's so rare to meet someone who values honesty and sincerity as much as I do. It really does create that sense of security and trust that's so hard to find these days.
Okay, yeah, I can see how that would be way more effective than just saying like, hey, nice shoes. You're basically validating her core beliefs and making her feel seen.
Exactly. And the Course argues that this kind of validation is incredibly powerful. It creates a connection that goes beyond just superficial attraction.
But how can you be sure that connection is genuine? Are you really connecting with her or just with the like image of her desires that you've created based on the information you got?
That's a really important question.
Hmm.
And it brings us back to those ethical considerations. Are we just meeting someone's needs in a way that benefits both people? Or are we, being manipulative?
It reminds me of that whole debate about advertising. Are they informing consumers or are they creating artificial needs? But with dating, it feels even more complicated because you're dealing with real emotions and vulnerability.
Absolutely. The stakes are much higher when you're talking about personal relationships.
Mm.
And there's always that potential for, someone getting hurt.
So, how does maximum seduction address those ethical concerns?
Well, they do talk about consent and respecting boundaries,
Yeah.
but it honestly feels more like an afterthought than a core principle. And some of the language they use, like slipping inside her mind, just makes me a little uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's a little creepy. It doesn't sound very respectful, to be honest.
Right. And that's why it's so important to approach these techniques with a lot of caution and self-awareness. We need to be really honest with ourselves about our intentions and make sure we're not using these tools to like pressure or manipulate someone.
Okay, so let's say someone's listening to this and they're thinking, wow, some of these techniques sound pretty effective. Maybe I should try them. What advice would you give them?
Well, the first thing I would say is check your intentions. Are you genuinely interested in connecting with this person on a deeper level, or are you just looking for, a quick win?
Right. Authenticity is key. I think people can usually tell when you're being genuine.
Well, absolutely. And remember, communication should be a two-way street. It's not just about eliciting information and mirroring it back. It's about listening, empathizing, and building real rapport.
So it's not about abandoning your own personality or values. It's more about finding that balance where you can connect with someone authentically, but also be aware of like the psychology of communication.
Exactly. The best communicators are the ones who can combine these techniques with their own unique style
Mm.
and genuine charisma.
Okay, so we talked about the psychology, the language patterns, and the ethics, but how effective are these techniques in practice? Do they actually work?
Well, the people who created this course make some pretty bold claims about their success rates. But like with any self-help product, I think we need to be a little skeptical.
Right, they are trying to sell something. Is there any actual research or evidence to back up their claims?
Actually, there is a growing body of research on the psychology of persuasion. A lot of it comes from the field of neuro-linguistic programming, or NLP.
Oh, NLP, I've heard that term before. Can you give us a quick rundown of what it is?
Sure. Basically, NLP is a model of communication and human behavior. It looks at how our thoughts, language, and actions are all connected, and how we create these internal maps of reality that influence our experiences.
So it's like the software that runs our brains.
That's a great analogy. And NLP practitioners believe that if you understand the code of that software, you can reprogram it to achieve whatever you want.
That's both fascinating and a little terrifying. Like, what if someone hacks into my brain and makes me do things I don't want to do?
Well, that's the ethical dilemma we keep running into, right? But NLP techniques are used in a lot of different contexts, from therapy and personal development to business and, yes, even seduction.
So how does NLP connect to the techniques we're discussing from maximum seduction?
A lot of the language patterns and concepts we've been talking about actually have roots in NLP. For example, mirroring someone's language and behavior is a classic NLP technique for building rapport.
What about those presuppositions and embedded commands we talked about earlier? Are those NLP techniques too?
Absolutely. NLP is all about using language to subtly influence thoughts and behaviors. It recognizes how powerful words can be in shaping our perceptions and guiding our actions.
This is making me think about how much of our communication happens below the surface. We're always sending and receiving messages without even realizing it.
That's right. And that's why it's so important to be aware of the language we use and how it affects other people. We have a responsibility to use these tools thoughtfully and ethically.
Okay, well, I think I need a whole separate deep dive on NLP after this. Are there any resources you recommend?
There are some great books and articles out there, and we'll be sure to include links in the show notes. But the most important thing is to just be more mindful of the language you use, both with yourself and with others.
Words have power, right? We should use them wisely.
Well said. Now, before we wrap up this part of our exploration, there's one final technique from the Maximum Seduction course that we haven't talked about yet.
Ooh, is this like their secret weapon?
It's not really a secret weapon, but it is a technique they call fractionation. And it's a bit more complex than the other language patterns we've covered.
All right, you're leaving us hanging. I guess we'll have to wait for part 3 to find out what fractionation is all about.
That's right. Stay tuned for the grand finale of our deep dive into Maximum Seduction.
All right, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into maximum seduction. We've covered a lot from elicitation and mirroring to those, well, kind of strange language patterns. But last time, you left us hanging with that cliffhanger about fractionation. What is that all about?
Well, fractionation is this technique where you basically try to create an emotional roller coaster for the other person. You're rapidly shifting them through a cycle of like positive and negative states.
Okay, that sounds pretty intense. So you're saying they're like deliberately playing with someone's emotions to create a connection. Isn't that kind of manipulative?
It can be seen that way, definitely. The Maximum Seduction course presents it as a way to like amplify emotional intensity. So you create this
Yeah.
like deeper bond through a shared experience. But like with any technique that messes with someone's emotions, the ethical considerations are super important.
So how does this fractionation thing actually work? What does it look like in a real conversation?
Imagine you're telling a really captivating story, something that evokes strong emotions. You might start with a happy moment, then shift to something sad or scary, and then bring it back to a happy ending.
So you're taking them on this like storytelling roller coaster, but how does that lead to seduction?
The idea is that by going through all these emotional ups and downs, you create a sense of like vulnerability and connection. When someone experiences those intense emotions with you, it can speed up the process of building trust and rapport.
Yeah, I get that. Like sharing a personal story, even one that's a little sad or difficult, can make you feel closer to someone. You're letting them into your world and they're seeing a different side of you.
Exactly. And the course suggests that by uh, consciously creating these emotional shifts, you can make that feeling of connection even stronger.
But isn't there a risk of going too far? What if you accidentally trigger a negative emotion that they're not ready to deal with?
That's the danger, right? Anytime you're trying to like manipulate someone's emotions, you need to be really careful. You have to be able to read their cues and adjust your approach. Otherwise, you might end up doing more harm than good.
It sounds like walking a tightrope, honestly. One wrong move and you could ruin the whole thing.
And just to be clear, we're not endorsing this technique. We're simply trying to understand how it works and what the potential risks are.
Right. Knowledge is power, even if we wouldn't use this technique ourselves. It's good to be aware of it. That way we can recognize it if someone tries to use it on us.
Definitely.
Yeah.
The more we know about the psychology of persuasion, the better we can navigate these complex social situations.
So we've explored all these different techniques from maximum seduction, some more ethical than others. It's been a fascinating journey, and honestly a little unsettling at times. What are the main takeaways you hope listeners will walk away with?
I think the biggest takeaway is that language is incredibly powerful. We can use it to connect with people, build relationships, and even influence their behavior.
Hmm.
But we have to use that power responsibly. We need to be aware of the potential impact our words can have on others.
We've also learned that seduction is really about persuasion. It's about understanding what makes people tick, what they want, and how to communicate with them in a way that resonates.
And while there are techniques that can help us with all of that, the best connections are the ones that are built on authenticity, empathy, and genuine respect.
So to wrap up our deep dive into maximum seduction, let's remember that while these techniques might offer some insights into attraction, real connection goes beyond tricks and manipulation. It's about building genuine relationships based on mutual understanding and respect. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.